I am joined today by a fellow named Patrick OLoughlin, who recently started a Substack. So he's getting his writings out there, and he wrote an article for Build Remote about the intersection of remote work and loneliness, and looked at sort of the upsides, the downsides, and has a pretty interesting takeaway on maybe where things are going. If you've noticed, he also has the exact same last name as me, so he does happen to be my brother. So this will be a little bit of a different conversation than normal, but I'm interested to hear from Patrick, who's learned a lot about the loneliness epidemic and looked at it through the lens of technology and entrepreneurship, sort of starting your own business and how all that works together. So thanks for joining me today, Patrick.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it, going through the rigorous process of getting on the Build Remote YouTube channel. So yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm just curious about the loneliness epidemic and always looking at it through a lens of entrepreneurship to try to solve some of these issues. And yeah, I mean, it's just been staggering looking at some of the data around the loneliness epidemic, and we can get into some statistics. But yeah, there's some interesting overlap between, you know, the working remote revolution and maybe some potential there to actually help cure the loneliness epidemic. When maybe it seems more intuitive that it would make the issue worse. But yeah.
So let's start with the loneliness epidemic. What does that mean? What's happening? What are the numbers? What are causes? Who's it happening to?
Yeah. It looks like it's kind of happening across the Western world, and it's a little hard to compare apples to apples because a lot of these studies have come out at different times and they have sort of loose definitions around what loneliness actually means. But certainly Cigna came out with a big study in 2020, I believe, so like kind of peak pandemic. And you know, that's just some staggering numbers. These are US based, but it's really affecting, the general thing is that it's affecting every generation, but more so the younger generation than the older one. So the younger adults, 18 to 24, 79% of them report feeling lonely, whereas seniors, 66 and up, only 41%. So almost double in sort of Gen Z, which is scary. I want to try to figure out if that's compared to a cohort, 100 years ago or even 50 years ago, if that's generally the case, if people that are older are less lonely than younger people. It seems like it wouldn't be that way, but in any event, it's definitely like increasing, and it's a real problem. Looks like things have a little bit improved since the pandemic. I mean, that's would be pretty obvious there, and not crazy to assume that things have gotten better for people in general. But the overall trend over the last decade, it's still pretty alarming. Loneliness numbers are still very high. Another study came out by Fortune.com is claiming that 1 in 3 Americans are reporting feeling more lonely than they've ever felt before. So again, like some of these, just the way that they're naming or categorizing loneliness is a little bit tough to compare apples to apples, but the general gist is that it's pretty alarming. A lot of people are concerned about it. Harvard just had a big conference over it with like policymakers and trying to approach it through a lens of kind of policy. And it just seemed a little bit stale as far as what the approaches are to trying to solve things. But yeah, that's the general gist, is that it's affecting the younger population. It's gotten a little bit better since the pandemic, but still on a large scale, very much an issue.
Let's take a quick step back, because you made me realize we probably should define what loneliness means, because you said there's probably, everyone looks at it differently. And then we're talking about loneliness, work from home, and remote work. So why don't you quickly define loneliness, and I'll define the other two.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's this awesome quote that I really like from Jordan Peterson on this podcast to do with this guy, John Deloney. If you want to check it out, episode 307. But they go through, this guy wrote a book on sort of how, we're so lonely, and all these trends of people journaling a ton and going to psychiatrists or psychologists, and just all these indications that we're a super lonely society. And I think Jordan Peterson just put it really well as far as the utility of friendship, obviously the opposite of loneliness. So he says that sanity is distributed across humanity. It's not something that's inside our heads. It's something that is nested inside a hierarchical sequence of proper relationships. It's crowdsourced amongst your healthy friendships. So it just talks about it speaks to just the need for healthy friendships. It's sanity is an absolute. It's not coded into us. So we basically need healthy relationships to bounce ideas off of. We bounce our behaviors off one another, and the people that love you and care about you will give you positive and negative feedback. So you can tell right away. I can tell, if someone, your friends will tell you through eye contact or even with words sometimes if you're doing the right thing or the wrong thing. And in complete isolation, we go insane. I mean, even our most, antisocial criminals don't want to be put in isolation. So that's like the biggest punishment you can have for a human being. So that just speaks to like the utility of friendship and healthy relationships. And so loneliness, I'm sure it takes on all, shapes and sizes. It's a little bit tough when you read, some of these kind of boring research studies. It's always just like, well, with loneliness increasing, it can increase depression and anxiety. It's just, very generic sort of like depression, anxiety, I feel like is the answer to everything. But yeah, I mean, that really speaks to just the need for healthy friendships, I suppose. So
yeah,
sort of the opposite of loneliness.
To really simplify it, it's sort of the absence of healthy relationships. And then if you're looking at the other two, remote work and work from home, I make a distinction between those, and you do in your article as well. I think that's important to point out quickly too, where I would say remote work is working outside of a physical office, and I would say work from home is pretty self-implied, but it's working from your residence. So those are clearly overlapping, but they are actually slightly different. So I wanted to ask you, like, what do you see as the issues with working from home, with that distinction in mind, working from home and loneliness? What kind of issues would you see there happening?
Yeah, I mean, working from home, it really depends. You put out that great question today on Reddit that kind of blew up, and people talking in the chat. It really just, I think it depends. You and I are a good example. I mean, you may or may not have a couple kids. I don't know how much you're divulging there, and wife at home. So there's a lot more going on at home. I'm a single guy, I live by myself. So you can definitely divide that, and it would go along with the trend of these Gen Z, younger generation being more lonely. If you're living by yourself or even have a couple of roommates at home, it's not as thriving of a healthy, loving relationships as if you have a family with young children there. But yeah, I mean, that's the point I try to make in the article too, is just that, yeah, remote work and work from home have are synonyms just because of where it was born out of the pandemic, where the only option to work when you're working remote was at home. And so really, if you can divorce the two terms, I mean, really what the big revolution, and we'll talk about this later, but is just that you don't have to work. You basically have freedom of association during work hours. And so that means that could be anywhere. And so if we try to reimagine how we're going to work, or how we could work in the most optimal way to be around people that basically love, or these healthy relationships that we talked about being such, you have to maintain sanity, for lack of a better way to describe it. The possibilities are endless now that we're divorced from our employer. Like, it's just because with the same, check of the employer name is on the same check as ours, we don't have to work in the same actual area, physical space. So, I think, remote work just means that we're divorced from our employer during work hours. Working from home is obviously pretty self-explanatory. It means we're going to be isolated in our home. It's very much associated with the pandemic. It's all kind of mixed up in that very hyper loneliness time for all of us. And like I said, I mean, depending on your situation, you could have a lot more going at home. Maybe all of your loved ones are home. Maybe you've had some kids and they're your best buddies now. maybe you struggle to make friends elsewhere, and so that's what you chose to do. But if you're like, a typical young 20s living in the city, it's going to be pretty, it's obviously a very isolating situation. I mean, a good example, a friend of mine working remote for a tech company, BDR, which is kind of intro to sales. She had a path to, become an account executive. If you ever worked in software sales, it's like a huge jump in salary. It's a huge jump in pay. She's a few months away from that. And she's just like massively lonely. She's very extroverted too. That's another axis, obviously, we can talk about is how extroverted you are versus introverted, how much social interaction you need to maintain a healthy balance in your life. But she opted to take a job at a software company that has, a thriving work environment. They have a really cool office and everyone comes in, 5 days a week. And she chose to opt in for that and also take less pay and a longer path to become an account executive. So a longer path to promotion. And that's crazy. I mean, no one would assume, of course, at the beginning of the pandemic, usually being able to work remote is a benefit. But, we have these examples, these edge cases of people these young, Gen Zers that they crave physical interaction. And so, yeah, I mean, sort of the point of my article, which maybe we're getting to later, is just that if you kind of can reimagine how we can reassociate during work hours, we could come up with some cool things. I mean, maybe she could get an office with a bunch of her friends and work together there. But I think a lot of people don't think about reimagining work hours as something you can do through a social lens. Instead, it's just based on, the employer you have.
Yeah. So you bring up a couple different ways to look at it too. If the basic premise is, does remote work make people more lonely or make them less lonely? If that's the basic question we're trying to answer right now, you brought up multiple ways that you can slice that. So from listening to you talk, one is introvert versus extrovert, right?
Yeah.
Another one is your phase in life. So if you're 23 and move to a new city, which I did at one point, the last thing I'd want to do is work from home, right? Now I'm 35, and you outed me as a father. Thank you. So
yes, yeah,
now and a husband. So now the last thing I'd want to be doing is sitting in an office with a bunch of semi-strangers all the time, right? So it changes. Yeah. So it's extrovert versus introvert. It's phase of life. And then the other thing I'd want to talk about and kind of get your take on is it's undoubtedly like an increase in personal responsibility, remote work. So if you work in an office, your interactions with people, physical interactions with other humans are built in for you. And you can extend that to the quality of work. Like there's people around that are also working, so you better be working, right? Whereas when you're at home, you better be self-driven to sort of get the stuff done that day. It's like something like homeschooling versus school. You can send your kids to school and the whole package is there, but you sort of better accept what's offered. Or you could homeschool, which is a lot more personal responsibility, but you can build it the way you want. You could choose either way. I'm not saying one's better than the other, but it's definitely an increase in personal responsibility. So it's if you are going to make yourself responsible for going out and having those meaningful connections, then remote work can help you with social connections because you will spend more time with people you choose rather than more time with just people, which are your coworkers. If you like it built in for you, or that's the right phase of your life, or you're an introvert versus an extrovert, you'd have to, you prefer the office because that's just, you go in, there's 5-6 people you work closely with, and there's 80 people around you, just physically around you. And there you go, you have what you need. So there's a lot to it, but I want to ask you about that, like the personal responsibility part of it. How would you view personal responsibility in the loneliness and working from home thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, that's a huge part of it. I mean, yeah, you have to be self-driven to be able to get up. I mean, not to change the axis you're talking about, but it is related to, just having a separate space to work. Like people go to cafes now too, just to work. I do pretty much every day just to be around other people that are working, because there's some psychology around, not being in your space of leisure and also your space of work. I know you have, an office that's outside of your home as well. So I think that's pretty clear. It would become pretty clear, like probably if you have the means, you probably just don't want to be working from your actual place of leisure, your home. Like it's just too much to mix those two. So if we're going to work outside of the home, then it's like, well, you get some personal motivation from if you're working in a cafe, because you're just like, well, I can't do my laundry. I can't just watch TV. I'm here. I'm not going to be just on like, TikTok on my phone, because I'm like, why am I going to be at this cafe if I'm doing that? So that already builds in some sort of some framework for people to have to be more productive. So I mean, definitely the self-driven thing is there, but I mean, as far as you also brought up, like having like I think this friend of mine that took less pay to go into this office, it's like it's the best option there is right now to have potential to meet people that she might connect with. But it's a really, really poor setup, actually. Like I think in 10 or 15 years, once we've done this, decoupling from our employer is also the place that we have to set up and do our work hours. There'll be much better options for someone like this. Like she'll have the options to, okay, I know, she played D1 basketball. Okay, I'm going to go to a place that is full of D1 former athletes that like basketball, that are into XYZ reality TV show. And now we have like, 50 things in common. Whereas like, I'm hoping, throwing a dart, that this 2,000 person SaaS company is going to have like 2 or 3 people that may have similar things that I'm interested in. And, there's also that access too of like the bigger a company gets. We talked about this too before, where, a company I worked at, there was, 20 people versus when it grew to be 500 people. I had so much in common with 20 people. They're risk takers. They're joining a startup that is completely chaotic. So we have like, there's tons of selection biases there to filter us down to like, oh yeah, I connect with like almost all those people. When it became a 500 person company, there's still some of those people there. They're risk takers, sure. But by and large, it's gotten so broad that there's not a whole lot that binds us together, that unites us that have common interests. So, I mean, I guess that's slightly changing the topic, but I think, just as far as if you're looking through at the scope of like, we're trying to figure out how to help people make new connections. Like just a really elementary level thing would be, we work at the same 2,000 person company. Like it's not a great filter to actually, select for people that could be potentially good friends of yours or new.
Yeah. And that's a whole nother angle to look at it, is the culture of the office, the size of the office. It changed at your startup, and it sort of changed your social aspect of work as the company grew. And then on the remote side, you made me realize, like the company I was working at before this, where we were fully remote, it was one of my good friends that we were running the company together. Even though that's delivered over the internet, that's plenty of social connection, because we have a company we're trying to grow or have survived together. We're connecting on video pretty frequently, trying to sort things out together. It's a tiny company, 5-6 core full-time employees, something like that. And that actually has a setup of good social connections, even though it is over the internet, because we're sort of super connected on something. So there can be the positive aspects that way too. You can get some of that if it's the right setup. I think if it was 1,000 person company and everyone's spread across the country, maybe that doesn't work. But yeah, I think the other thing, like there's a lot of conflation going on, if that's even a word, I'm not sure, but you mentioned COVID. So it's like COVID and remote work happened at the same time, or work from home really happened at the same time for most people. So you can conflate the two. I don't like working from home. Well, do you not like working from home, or did you not like the COVID aspect of it?
Right. Yeah.
And then
that was traumatic for a lot of people too. It's like a traumatic experience. It's not even like, even if it was the same settings today, it's hard to be even objective about that experience because it's like a traumatic thing. Like they don't want to go back to that. So yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, and then just the internet in general would probably causes more loneliness than not.
Yeah.
That's what I would think. What factor does the internet play, specifically removing remote work, which is delivered over the internet? What does the internet play in like loneliness or isolation or feelings of self-worth?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've been trying to dig in sort of the causes, and sort of a lot of them are, again, just sort of generic, it seems like. But yeah, this Fortune article that came out saying 1/3 of Americans are lonelier than ever. It did point to, I think the title of the article was like, we're 50% human, 50% technology. And I didn't get too into the weeds on the article, but it's been part of my theory as well. I think, if you look at, like the internet, social media, I mean, everyone just blames everything on social media. It's becomes kind of a trope, but I think certainly it's like hitting, our very basic level circuitry in our brains, where if we look at an Instagram post, things like that, it is like it's hitting those levels of dopamine or whatever it is, positive responses that we feel like we're socializing, but it's completely artificial. So it's, almost like pornography is false intimacy. It's like, it seems like it's offering the same thing, but we're just looking at a computer screen. It's obviously not. It's tricking our very rudimentary lizard brains into thinking we're socializing. And of course, it's leaving something lacking in our lives. So I think people do. And then, and then if you just look at it from an axis of like information being passed to each other, text is probably the worst. Then a phone call is better. What we're doing now is a step better. But in person, you can't replicate in person, at least yet. I mean, maybe, when we get full-blown metaverse, we'll be able to smell each other or whatever. But, it's not even close to the information we can get back and forth from each other. And when you're trying to build trust and you build a relationship, it's all about trust. It's all about trying to figure out what that person's intent is, especially with new relationships. So there's just really nothing that takes the place of an in-person interaction. I mean, you can't fully get that yet, I think. And yeah, so like your old company, you guys already had a really strong relationship. You can maintain that, that's fine. But for creating new relationships, I think it's everyone is craving more in-person interactions. And I think it's just tough because then we want to just turn our phone is just so easy to turn back to, because we get those little hits of interaction that is like, oh, okay, I'm actually socializing. Like we wouldn't, if we took away all the technology, we would be so desperate to take action, but like we're like on like this, very base level drip of socialization that's keeping us from just like taking dramatic action, I think. But I think, another this guy, John Deloney, that was on that same podcast I quoted from Jordan Peterson, had a good point. He had a good theory too of like everything's commercialized as well, which is a little bit like technology, but sort of just that there's no interactions between like neighbors or anything anymore. Like if you want to ride to the airport or you want, a cup of sugar, it's like that's Uber. That's Amazon Prime. Instead, 50 years ago, it used to be many more potential interactions to create a relationship with someone. And they talk about a Benjamin Franklin quote, which I think is interesting. I actually couldn't find Benjamin Franklin quote in this, but Jordan Peterson said it, so I'll trust it. But he said something about, if you want to create a good relationship with a new neighbor, ask them for a small favor. And so I think it maybe sounds counterintuitive, but you ask them for a small favor, they feel good because they're able to help you. The key is that it's small. So they feel good, like they've done something to provide with value, and then they know that you're slightly in debt to them to provide them with a favor. So you get this this flywheel of reciprocation, and so that's another interesting point too. Aside from the technology, which is sort of enveloped in it, but the over commercialization of everything. We feel like a burden to each other, is how this guy puts it. Like we don't want to ask for favors at all. We feel like we're literally a burden for other people, and a lot of relationships are built on needing each other, right? So if we don't feel like we can ask someone for something else, then it's a tough way to get friendships started. But I think just in general. But yeah, I don't know. How about you? Do you think there's other angles of the technology side that are causing sort of loneliness? Or
no? Yeah, I would think the internet basically makes you more lonely, if I were to paint with a broad brush. So it's sort of what you said, but I would say the internet makes you more lonely in general. The Instagram thing, where everyone's life looks better than yours, even though it's not. It's just their photos on Instagram look better. So then, if we're operating off of that assumption that the internet makes you more lonely, and remote work is work delivered over the internet, I can totally see how it would make people more lonely and feel more isolated. And that's why some people do, and they feel a lot more because of work from home. The thing is, with the personal responsibility piece, if you so you've removed the office, you've removed being around all your coworkers, but that frees up time to be around people you choose rather than you just are given. And so that's the one piece. If you take the opportunity of remote work, you can substitute 40 hours a week with coworkers for 6 hours a week with friends, or at the gym with people you work out with, or lunch with your spouse, or whatever it is, right? And then if you remove the commute, which is probably about as lonely as you get, you're literally all sitting in metal things next to each other, a bunch of strangers all waiting to go someplace. If you remove that, you can substitute it in with something healthier. So all those options are there. Now, if you don't take advantage of those things that remote work free up for you, then you would essentially just by default be lonelier. That would be my take on it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, I think it's just completely, working from home is not working remote. It's not the same thing at all. It doesn't have to be the same thing. And I think, not to keep pushing my ideas of this article, but I think there's a huge potential then to reimagine how we think about working remote. If you have that potential now you don't have to work around the people that have the same employer. So that can open up a huge, potential. I mean, the way I kind of describe it, and there's obviously much better ideas out there, but kind of like a WeWork 2.0, but it's specialized you could do it across many different axes, but it could be, for maybe like for people that are really passionate about the work they do, graphic designers, or, I don't know, that's just the one that comes to mind because maybe they're a little bit more passionate about what they do. You could have an office of just all graphic designers. They don't have the same employer, but it's like, oh, we're going to bounce ideas all the time. We're all pretty artsy. We all have a ton in common. For something, I don't know, I was in software sales for a while. You could certainly have a passionate group of guys that really love that. But for someone like me, it's kind of just the paycheck. But I'm also into entrepreneurship. I'm also into basketball, surfing, and Bitcoin, whatever. Like, you could certainly have an office in large cities where you can have groups based on interests and shared values. And that's it's not a recipe for friendship, but it's a huge selection bias to be like, we have the potential to create new relationships here is 10x the amount of just the other 2,000 people that I randomly work with at this office that work for the same SaaS company. It's not, so you could be much more measured or premeditated, I guess, with the way you create an office. Like, now we can just create offices completely untethered from the employer. We can just build them around how do you make an optimal work setting for socialization. So, that's what I was talking about. The three kind of points are like, all right, selection bias based on interests and shared values, whatever that axis may be, whether it's your job, like a graphic designer, or the things you're into. Secondly, to have some experiences you do together. So there's some sort of stakes, like playing together with some sort of stakes. So that could be working on a project together. That could be playing a sport together. It could be performing music together. But the point there is that, the opposite would be like at a networking event. Like, maybe we have a lot of things in common, but we're just trying to meet each other. So in an interview or a networking event, that's the only thing we're doing. And so we can basically we can use all of our CPUs in our brain to just present the ideal version of ourselves to the other person. But when you're actually working on something together, you're playing a sport together. Everyone knows to play a sport, a team sport. We talked about it before, but playing basketball, you can almost tell how a person is just by the way, without even speaking a word to them. When you're playing basketball with them the first time, you can tell, if they're selfish or they're not, if they clam up, after a big shot, if they're lazy or if they're hustlers. Like, you can tell a ton about that, because there's too much going on. Doing something with stakes, it strips away all of that falsity that you can project to someone in an interview, because like you're just focusing all your energy on trying to actually accomplish something together. So that's where like actual, the friendships actually start to begin, is a shared experience. The shared interest stuff just like gives people confidence to take the first step, because like, oh, we have a ton in common, so like it's going to be easy to start a conversation. Who knows if we'll go anywhere, but like I have a ton of confidence that like we see the world the same way. And then the last one, that I have in that article is just to have medium to long-term commitment. And the example I use is traveling in Mexico during the pandemic, which was an amazing experience. Huge selection bias of interests, people that, didn't really care about, weren't worried about the pandemic or COVID-19 too much. They had the means to get down there. So at that time, it was a lot of entrepreneurs going down there. And then we had the shared experience of with stakes of having to navigate this, we're all in this foreign country trying to find the housing and shelter and all that type of stuff, obviously not that hard, but there are some stakes there to that. And I had some amazing friendships down there with guys I met from all over the world. And fast forward a couple of years later, like I've lost touch with all of them. And partly that's on me, of course, and them, but it really has to do with this medium to long-term commitment to a physical space. So if you're not going to see someone again, probably, it's just like, what's really the point of staying up with them? So if you kind of can follow those three criteria, I think we could redo the way we work together, and it could really be just an optimal experience. You just going to work every day with a bunch of buddies that are interested in the same stuff, working on stuff together. Like, that's amazing. I think that's what this unlocks, remote work unlocks, and it has nothing to do with working from home.
Right. Yeah. And just to add to that point, I've gone to some co-working spaces, and you mentioned one in your article, but Bitcoin Commons in Austin, which is a co-working space for Bitcoin companies, which is pretty sweet. And then another example in Austin I saw was essentially real estate startups, and there's a company in the back, and they got an office space, and they only needed the back, and the whole front they turned into a co-working space, and they essentially fund some of the companies in the front. And so there's like 8 little companies in there with between like 2 to 6 people. They all have their own little space. They have a shared kitchen, and some of them are funded by the company in the back, and they all sort of help each other out because they're all in the real estate thing, like industry and startups. So they've got a bunch of common bonds there. And then a different way to slice it, I think, is years ago in Boston, well, as you know, I'm just telling whoever's listening, really. But I had a marketing company I was trying to start after college, and I joined this group on the South Shore of Boston that was all business owners, and there was only one person per industry allowed. So there was one lawyer, one accountant, one carpenter, one marketer, right? One trade show person. Like, they just only allowed one per industry. And we had about 30 people that would meet once a month for breakfast and have a meeting, and different people would present. That's a good connection because it's local, number one. You all live in a very tight area. And 2, you can say, oh, I need a lawyer for this. And immediately it's a sales thing. And so there were tons of referrals going on. That was the main point of it. And that's another way that co-working spaces could develop, is essentially we accept one person per industry. And you could even tighten it up. We accept one graphic designer. One developer, one website developer, one video developer, right? And you could do it that way too. That would give you a head start on the social stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, exactly. Like on the axis of like an ecosystem, business ecosystem, pretty much, and having someone from each realm. And yeah, it makes a ton of sense. And then you're not competing on stuff. You can refer stuff to each other. There's definitely there's so many different ways to slice it up. And I think that's a good point of like a kind of maybe a smaller area. You can do that within a geographical area, lends itself to that. Bigger cities, are more anonymous, like we were talking about before. So which is, harder to make connections. A smaller town already has a selection bias. So if you live in a beach town in California, you're going to be interested in a lot of similar things already. But if you live in a major city, it's like there's so many different walks of life that it's harder to do. But the advantage the large city has is that you have the critical mass then to get super niche. So you can start to build things like a Bitcoin office. People there, are all into that, very kind of unique niche that then also projects that they have similar values. It cuts across so many different things. So I think the interests that you pick, they're not all created equal. Like how you organize, if you're going to organize by interests, some interests say more about who you are than others. But it's a good example. I mean, there's so many ways to do it. It's just, I think just back to the beginning point of it just needs to be decoupled from working from home. It's not even the same discussion. And then also I mean, we were kind of touching on this before, but I thought this guy had a great point in the Reddit post you had today. Careless Coconut 5307. My absolute dog. I love Careless Coconut. Yeah, he's great. But he said he heard a quote about loneliness and how it doesn't matter how many people you're actually around. It's about the connections. At my job, even though there's a lot of people, I still felt lonely, which, might seem obvious to some people, but it's like, I think that's what, like people, that's another misnomer is like, oh, I'm around a ton of people. Like cities, notoriously, it can be the loneliest place, I mean, you're around tons of people. They're all strangers. And it's why? Because you don't have anything necessarily in common. So you don't know if you can bond. Like people just don't have the trust. And so if you can build that into the structure of where you work, you're like, listen, we're going to set this all up like you're 5-year-olds. Like you guys all have all these things in common and we're going to like force you to do these activities together. Like that's, I think, where we need to get back to. Like we literally need to treat adults as like, fifth graders at like, a summer camp trying to do icebreakers. It's like, we need to just, set it up, like inspire it so well so that it's super easy, remove all the friction from talking to each other. Because I mean, we didn't touch on this and we can go on, onto it another time, but there's just so many indications that we're like so bad at socializing too. Once you get lonely, then you're like, you can't overcome it either. And maybe that's another technology thing, but we need our binky all the time. Everyone always has headphones in. You're constantly looking at your phone. If you're ever uncomfortable, you have this thing, you can this black mirror you can look into that's going to reflect back whatever you want to see. So it's like we're also just gotten really bad at socializing too. It becomes a little bit of a downward spiral. It gets a little bit scary that, I mean, people with headphones on at a bar used to be just people that were probably autistic or had some social issues. Now 99% of people are walking around with headphones in, and it's partly because there's a lot of great entertainment out there, but it's also that just we've gotten really bad at socializing. So I think this being able to reorganize during the work hours in really optimal social ways, like we can do it if we're just like completely decouple it, from working from home and think about it, from how you just like, what would be your optimal setup? Like, who'd you want to be around? All your best friends, or if you already have your best friends around you, or you want to create, you want new friends. If you're a younger person, you don't have that social circle yet, and you used to try to find it through your employer. Well, we have like a much better hit ratio. It's going to be like, you're going to like 9 out of 10 people instead of like 5 out of 2,000,
Yeah. It's interesting. I think if I were to wrap up my final thoughts, and then I'll ask you for your final thoughts as well. But if you are a remote employee and you're experiencing loneliness, the other thing I'd just add here is that if you're new to it, it takes time. So the people that have been doing it for 10 years probably don't feel as lonely as the people that have been doing it for 3, and 2 of those years with the COVID stuff. So it's really, you've been doing it with all the options for 1 year or whatever it's been. It takes time. So I've worked from home for 10 years and I remember the stages that take years. Sadly, you wish you could solve it in like a week, but it's like, this is great for 2 years. And then year 2, it's like, I got to get out of the house more. And then it's like year 3.5 where you get the gym membership. And then it's year 5 where you're like, I could do happy hour on Tuesday at 4. That would be fun if anyone's around, or I could play basketball at lunch. Actually, that's like year 9 or 10 for me that I figured that one out. So it
Yeah.
takes a while is one. And then 2 is like just the personal responsibility thing. It used to be sort of handed to you, the social thing, if you were in an office, and now it's your responsibility. If you're able to use it, it's better because you can build it exactly how you want instead of going to this like adult kindergarten. You can build it exactly how you want, but that takes work. Those would be my few things about the sort of summarize my take on it. What, in say 90 seconds or so, what's your take on or summary of all this, or where it's all headed, or however you'd want to close it up?
Yeah, no, well, I think those are great parting words for people that are actually struggling with this. Maybe is to like bias towards action. Pretty much, it sounds like is the summary, and you have the keys now. Like it's not like it's on you. So you have to basically be an entrepreneur within your social life, which is interesting. I didn't really think about it that way. No, I mean I think just the summary is just that remote work is not the same as working from home. That remote work presents us with a huge opportunity to reimagine how we want to spend our work hours. And we can do that in a completely novel and social way around either people that we already know and love, or people that we have like a really high probability of like creating awesome and great like long-term relationships with. And like the internet's an amazing way to filter people, so we can already leverage that. And so that would be like an awesome kind of utopian way to think about working in the future, is like around people that you really have a high hit rate of being able to connect with. So, or you can just have kids, isn't that, that's another way to do it.
Have your coworkers.
Yeah. Just go ahead and have your coworkers.
Exactly.
Yeah. Nice.
So if people want to read your work or connect with you to follow up on the discussion, how should they go about doing that?
Yeah, sure. I just started a Substack. So Patty Never Substack. I think it's pattynever.substack.com, and then pattynever.com too. It's PATTYNEVER. And then you can find me at Patty_Never on Twitter too. And please reach out if you have any thoughts. Curious to discuss this further with anyone that's interested in the loneliness epidemic topic.
Cool. Thanks for coming on.
Nice.
This was great, but I got to go play basketball.
Nice. I love it.
See you later.
Later.